Hi everyone, Farmer Amber here from Sustainable Jungle, where we share sustainability tips, tricks, hacks, products, brands, and stories to better our planet. And today, we're digging down to get to the roots of something more and more important with the rising global food crisis and destruction of Earth's arable land: sustainable gardening. Instead of soiling our soil, gardens, and planet with chemicals and GMO plant varieties, we should be using our own backyards to return to our own natural, holistic roots, in every sense. And with the future of global food systems hanging in the precarious balance of climate change and chemical-intensive monocropping practices, being a little more self-sufficient when it comes to what goes on our plate isn't a bad idea either. Ecological planting not only encourages better garden yields, but a healthy plant ecology and biodiversity of necessary insects and pollinators. You don't necessarily need a natural green thumb to do it either. Through a little intentional planning, conscious plant selection, and regular maintenance, it's actually much easier than you think. But first, what is an ecological garden? Now, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that any garden is sustainable. Gardens equal plants, equal nature, equal good, right? Well, sort of. Growing plants which sequester carbon from the atmosphere is inherently an environmentally beneficial act. But many modern garden practices that rely heavily on GMOs and chemicals are actually doing more harm than the plants they produce can counteract. So instead, sustainable gardening takes a natural, holistic approach and works symbiotically with the natural world, not against it. For example, instead of killing all the bugs in your garden, it uses natural tactics to encourage healthy insects while discouraging the propagation of destructive ones. The goals of the ecological gardener are to best optimize and encourage the garden functions: attracting pollinators, sequestering carbon, and producing plants, flowers, vegetables, whatever it is that you're growing. The better plants grow, the more yield that you get, and the more carbon they consume. That means when it comes to your garden ecosystem, efficient equals ecological. That said, you don't need a huge backyard or garden bed to join in either. Ecological gardening is defined by its principles, not its shape or size. And yours might take the form of a container garden, an indoor hydroponic garden, raised garden beds, in-ground beds, or maybe even a community garden. I use a combination of raised garden beds at my home, since I don't own the property that my house is on, and a community garden. And if you really don't have the means or space to garden at home, community gardens are a wonderful way to get all the benefits of growing a garden with none of the space requirements. This is actually where I started years ago, and I still love my community garden so much that I now serve on the board of directors for it and continue to garden there. You'll often receive benefits that make the annual membership fee well worth it, including free soil and compost, composting services, a free seed library, shared community crops, and of course, a wonderful knowledge and support sharing network of experienced gardeners who are happy to mentor more inexperienced folks. Some community gardens like mine even allow you to bypass the monetary fee in exchange for a set number of volunteer hours, making it more accessible to more people. Once you've decided on which form your garden will take, it's time for the fun part: picking your plants. Now, if you're planting vegetables and fruits, opt for heirloom or organic varieties, ideally both, instead of GMOs and hybrid plant species. These not only yield a tastier, more nutritionally dense crop, but they're naturally resistant to pests and climate shifts, which is a criteria that's becoming increasingly necessary for successful gardeners. In addition to choosing heirloom varieties of vegetables, you can also choose more eco-friendly plants, period. For example, the most carbon-consumptive veggies include onion, celery, potatoes, carrots, and zucchini. If you're planting herbs and perennial landscaping plants, always choose native plants that best complement your area's natural habitat and prevent the spread of invasive species. Native plants will obviously differ depending on where you live, so use a native plant database to familiarize yourself with the appropriate ones to you, and to help out, we'll be sure to link to one in the description below. Something as simple as choosing native plants and aiming for plant diversity are major steps toward ecologically sound, biodiverse gardening that will attract and nurture various forms of local wildlife and insects. For example, a biodiverse herb garden should not just contain annual culinary herbs like basil and cilantro, but native perennial herbs as well, such as lavender, calendula, echinacea, Russian sage, and bee balm, that attract native insects, bees, and butterflies. Plus, you can harvest the flowers, after giving them ample time for the bees to feed on them, of course, and dry them into your very own sustainable tea with various calming, gut health, and immune-boosting benefits. And this might sound obvious to any seasoned growers out there, but for beginners, it's a really easy mistake to make. Remember to choose plants appropriate for your particular climate zone. Otherwise, you might find yourself disappointed with lack of growth and ripening before fall frosts. Here in the alpine desert regions of the Rocky Mountains where I live, I'm in Zone 5A, which means I have a paltry 3-ish months between first and last frost dates. So I need to be very careful about selecting hardy plant varieties, and I still pretty much need to start all of my seeds indoors at the beginning of the spring. Now, if you're not sure what zone you are, we're going to link to some of the zone maps below, where all you have to do is plug in your zip code and it will tell you. Once your plants are chosen, it's time to actually plan your garden. And to maximize the efficiency of all those plants, you're going to need to consider 3 main things: spacing, placing, and timing. First, space. In order to properly allocate enough space for your plants, look on the seed packet or the starter tag for recommended spacing between it and other plants. If you're seeding, you'll probably want to start by planting more than you think you'll actually need to account for the fact that not all of the seeds are going to sprout, and then thinning them as needed. And you can also then give those sprouts away to others who need them. This is really important because too few plants will make for a less efficient garden and leave plants more exposed to heat and pests, but too close plants will obviously choke each other out and not give each other enough space. I like to mock up my garden layout at the beginning of every season in my little handy garden notebook here, so I draw them out exactly where they're going to be, and then I also keep a logbook in here of when I seed things, when they sprout, and then just keep notes on how well things performed overall. And this is really helpful from year to year for me to look back and determine what plants were good, when starting them was good, what things worked next to each other, and etc. The second consideration is placement. Now, as you mock up your garden layout, keep in mind that, just like people, not all plants get along. And knowing which plants will help and hinder each other's productivity is key to cultivating a successful and high-producing crop. This is known as companion planting, and there are so many different combinations out there which you can easily look up online, but here's a couple common rules of thumb that we like to keep in mind. 1. Different varieties of pepper should never be planted near each other due to cross-pollination potential. Spicy bell peppers might be a rude surprise. Scented herbs like basil and oregano can be planted near the edges of pest-prone plants like corn and tomatoes to prevent these pests. Some people also say that it actually enhances the flavor of your tomatoes as well. I don't know if I've ever tried it the other way where I've had a comparison crop to that, but it is a good idea to start trying to do that. And garlic should be planted near lettuce and cabbage also to prevent insects. Now, number 3 is timing. The back of each seed packet will tell you the maturation period of each plant. Those with long maturity times are usually recommended to plant indoors in the spring. Otherwise, you might risk not getting a harvest before the fall frost. Things like the brassica family, broccoli, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, melons, and winter squash all have long harvest times and should probably be started indoors for most growing zones 6 and below. And spoiler alert, you do not need a greenhouse to plant seeds early. All you need is a heating pad, which I have right here, and that can even be bypassed if you have a warmer house. I just don't. And then either a sunny window or a grow light like this guy right here. And both of these can be purchased relatively inexpensively. I live in a literal tiny house, so I actually use an upcycled plastic drawer system for my seed starts as a cheap DIY greenhouse that I can easily move outside on warm days and then inside again on cold nights. Otherwise, wait until after the last date of frost in your area and sow seeds with shorter maturation periods like carrots, radishes, and lettuces directly in the garden. Once you've got your garden planted, you have to continue caring for those plants throughout the gardening season. And it's probably obvious that sustainable gardening is synonymous with organic gardening, which means we don't want to care for our garden with any kind of synthetic fertilizer, pesticide, fungicide, or herbicide. In fact, synthetic fertilizers are often too concentrated and will lead to overly fertilized soil in which living plants will grow deficient in iron, zinc, carotene, vitamin C, and copper protein. Instead, feed your plants with themselves. In other words, your own compost and worm tea is the single best thing you can do to solve any nutrient imbalances and deficiencies and improve soil structure while you're at it. Healthy soil rich in organic matter and microbes is also the best defense against garden pests that you have. Nutrient-deficient plants are weak plants, and they become especially susceptible to insects. Otherwise, you can control pests naturally through companion planting, regular harvesting, essential oil sprays, herb dustings like cinnamon, which is great for ants, by the way, and worst comes to worst, natural pesticides like diatomaceous earth. This is a fine silicate powder, and it's really great for stubborn insect infestations, but take care not to dust it on the flowers, as it will also kill beneficial insects. Your best bet is to kind of just sprinkle it around the base of the plant, of the soil, just until it kills the insects, and then once it has, wash it away thoroughly. And speaking of beneficial insects, attracting things like ladybugs, which eat aphids, is a great way to keep pests at bay and increase biodiversity all at once. I like to plant specific insect beneficial plants like marigolds that don't take up a ton of space throughout my garden and in between my other plants to provide pollinator food. And I also like to add an insect hotel to my gardens as well, just to provide some shelter for them. This one that I have here is kind of a fancy one, but you can also make your own using sawdust and sturdy cardboard tubes like that which you find in the middle of wrapping paper rolls. Now, what about weeds? Well, we're old school, so we say get your hands dirty and pull them yourself. And if you stay on top of it and weed as needed through the season, it's really not a huge chore. And you can either compost your pulled weeds or do the chop and drop method like I do, where you pull them and you leave them lie so they can break back down into the soil. You can also reduce your need to weed through cover cropping with things like clover in the spring and buckwheat in the fall, or applying a mulch around your plants. This not only protects the soil, adds microorganisms that live in it back to the soil, adds nutrients back into the soil as it breaks down, and also helps your plants thermoregulate and retain moisture, but it also prevents weed growth. To get rid of weeds in the beginning of the season before you start planting, say if you're starting a new garden bed or remediating one that was severely neglected, cover your garden in glass or clear greenhouse plastic. The sun will naturally kill the early crop of weeds, but you do want to make sure that the edges are completely sealed down to prevent any air circulation underneath, otherwise you'll be creating a little greenhouse that will have the opposite effect as intended. We also recommend getting a little hula hoe. This is just a little hand one, but there's also full length ones as well, and these are great for just those tender little brand new weeds that are coming up where all you have to do is scrape it in the soil and it pulls them up, root and all. And the best part is when all of your hard work pays off and you get to harvest your plants. But be sure to harvest throughout the season to keep your plants producing and operating efficiently. Certain early crops, like radishes and spinach, can even be harvested and then replanted for a second harvest before winter, even in a really short growing season like mine. And remember, an ecological garden is an efficient garden, so the more plants you produce, the more carbon they sequester from the atmosphere. And after your final harvest, you're going to want to put your bed to bed by completely pulling out all of the plants and roots and refreshing the soil with a top layer of compost and mulch before the winter. This ensures a healthy soil and minimal weeds next season. Be sure to study up on how to preserve food at home so none of that autumn abundance goes to waste. So this gardening season, make your green thumb even greener by incorporating some sustainability efforts into it. And as with anything sustainable living, it's about progress over perfection. If you're still getting your gardening feet wet on the whole, start by refusing chemical inputs this year, and then focus on maybe making your own compost next year, and so on and so forth. Like the plants themselves, it's all about growth. If you have any sustainable gardening tips we didn't cover today, and we know there's a lot of them out there, please drop them in the comments below to help us keep this conversation going. And don't forget to like and subscribe this video so that we can grow this channel right alongside our garden. Once again, I'm Amber from SJ, wishing you all a plantastic day.